My name is Roger Anderson. I work as the chief of detectives for the sheriff's department. I was married to Nancy for the last 19 years. When I first met her, she was a victim of an accident. Are you all right? I asked the girl who was just hit by a speeding car. She was still dazed and had no clue where she was. I held her and moved the hair from her face. God, she was beautiful. The paramedic van came and took her to the hospital. I got the call that the team caught the driver and put him where he belonged. The next day, I went to the hospital to get her statement. As I walked towards her room, my heart was pounding. Hey, Doc, where's the girl who came in last night? The one who was run over. Oh, Nancy Miller. She was lucky. No real injury. Just some concussion. But don't press her hard, he said. I entered the room. Miss Nancy, my name is Roger Anderson from the local PD. I am here to record your statement about last night. She narrated the incident, and I kept jotting down notes. After I was done, I walked out thanking her. As I walked out, my heart was pumping like a V8 engine. God, I think I am in love with her. As fate would have it, a few days later, I met her at a local fair. She was there with her friends. I was not willing to let go of my chance and walked up to her and asked her out. Well, it was awkward and weird, but she smiled and said, "Sure, pick me up from my home." Friday at 4. 2 days later, I picked her up from her home in my truck. How did you know I lived here? She asked. I am a cop. I do this for a living. She laughed. We kept meeting and soon started dating. She told me about her parents, her ambitions, and her ex-fiance. She was engaged to a guy named Brian Smith. They were together for 3 years, and he left her to marry the daughter of a rich Texas man. I did run a check on that name. I just wanted to check on that guy. Everything, she said, matched. He was married to Maria, and now had a 1-year-old daughter. Aside from a few speeding tickets, Brian didn't have any criminal history. He worked as a financial advisor at his father-in-law's firm. I did further investigations on my day off, and wasn't worried about any blowback. Worst case scenario, I'd get my wrist slapped for pushing too hard. What I found was that Mr. and Mrs. Smith were apparently a loving couple. There was no sign of any discord between the two. One of their neighbors described them as the perfect couple, so I was now not concerned that he would spoil the party. Satisfied that Brian was happily married, I continued to date Nancy. We were married about a year later, and almost 9 months to the day, our little girl, Jill, was born. Life had been good for 18 of our 19 years together. We had our share of disagreements, but nothing serious until recently. Usually, our disagreements would occur when we disagreed about doing something. Nancy was an only child and had been spoiled by her parents. However, over the years, she learned to curtail her stubbornness. She had her own event management agency and used to organize big parties. When our daughter was born, Jill became my little princess. We were especially close, and our family was very tight. However, for the past year, Nancy and I seemed to be drifting apart. I began to realize that we did less and less together. Still, our lovemaking was very good, and we did it at least 2 times a week, most weeks more. Nancy seemed the happiest when we were cuddled together. I knew she still loved me deeply. I still loved Nancy, but in a different way. It was no longer like the hot, passionate love we had when we were first married. We were like 2 old shoes that had seen better days but went together well. Still, I did love my wife deeply, and I especially loved the life we had built. It was when Jill finished high school, Nancy's change seemed to accelerate. She seemed to be at loose ends, and the closer it got to when Jill would leave for college, the more uneasy Nancy became. I was now the chief of detectives for the sheriff's department, and I had 32 detectives under me. Since this wasn't a high-crime county, the job wasn't too stressful. It did have its moments, but usually it was 9 to 5 for me. A month after Jill left, Nancy took me to a party at her friend's place. I had been at their place before, but this time it was a big shocker for me. Nancy introduced me to Brian, her ex-fiance. It was a quick introduction, and we moved away quickly. I had no idea that Brian would be there, but I was sure that Nancy knew. She immediately detached herself from me, which wasn't unusual, and began to circulate. But after an hour, I went looking for her and found her and Brian sitting on the front porch. When I walked out, Nancy's neck got slightly red, which was her tell that she was up to something I wasn't going to like. As a cop, you develop an internal instinct, and mine told me that this was real trouble. On the way home, we discussed Brian's presence. Nancy tried to blow it off like she was surprised to see him, and they were just catching up on old times. But her words were not coherent, and her story was not clean. I decided that I wasn't going to blow the whole thing out of proportion, but keep myself on guard. As a police officer, you are many times confronted with extremely unpleasant situations. Still, you have to handle them calmly and professionally. Sometimes, it was very distasteful. On my next workday after the barbecue, I did another investigation of Brian. What I found out was that his wife had died a year ago, and her death was not from natural causes. There was not a lot of information, but it looked like the investigation was done in a hurry, and the matter was hushed. Brian got her insurance money, and he was a rich man. Nothing on the record to make him a standout. He was in Japan when his wife died, removing him from the suspect list. As the months went on, we kept running into Brian at more and more functions. I knew this wasn't by accident, so I began to prepare myself for the worst. I figured any day now, Nancy would want us to sit down because she wanted to talk to me about something. Talk. She did, and she started when I had my guard down. It was a Friday night, and she was wearing my favorite pre-sex dress. I got up and quickly hugged her, and since these moments were now rare, I did not want to waste time. I quickly started and made sure that the climax was thunderous. Once we were done, we were snuggling, and I felt that my worries were for nothing. It was clear to me that Nancy still loved me as deeply as ever. "Roger, I want to talk to you about something," she said nervously, "and I don't want you to get mad. I want you to let me finish before you say anything." I felt like I just got shot by a .50 caliber slug right between my eyes. "You know that Brian was my first love," she explained. "We were engaged to be married. Then he fell in love with his wife, and we broke up. Since his wife's death, he's been devastated. He is so lonely. He tells me that he is still in love with me, and I have to admit that I'm still in love with him. But at the same time, I still love you too." I didn't say a word, and I was struggling to control my breathing and remain calm. This gave Nancy renewed courage because she smiled and continued, "I want to still be your wife, but I want to be with Brian also. Brian and I discussed it, and we think it would be fair that I stay with you for a week, and with him for a week." I slid out of bed, got dressed, and drove off without saying a word. I headed to my office and closed the door. I called Lopes. He came in and looked at my unshaven face, but knew not to ask, as he had seen me pull all-nighters numerous times before. I told him I didn't want to be disturbed unless it was something major. Fortunately, I was left alone. Is she really that dumb, or have I just been teleported to a different dimension? I thought to myself. I sat in my unlit office for hours. I kept going over and over the proposal that my wife had put to me. It was the most selfish thing she could have done. It was clear to me that Nancy wanted her cake and wanted to eat it too. That wasn't going to happen. She was going to have to choose. About 5 o'clock, I headed back home. I was super annoyed when I saw Brian's car in the driveway. This guy has some gall. It took me 5 minutes to calm down. I left my pistol in the car dashboard. I knew taking it inside would be catastrophic. Years of training did not prepare me for anything like this. I found them in the living room, sitting nervously. Nancy got up quickly and came over to give me a kiss. I pushed her away, and I could see she was hurt by that. I didn't care. "We need to talk about this," Nancy said nervously. "There's not much to talk about," I said curtly. "You either want to be with him, or you want to be with me. You can't have it both ways." "I don't think you've thought this proposal through completely," Brian said as he stared nervously at me. I'm not taking your wife away from you. I'll just be giving her the additional love she needs. Yes, we'll be sharing her, but she will never miss any of her wifely obligations. Now the inner rage was almost to a boiling point. This smug jerk had just told me that I should be willing to let Nancy sleep with him because she needs extra loving. I was disgusted with both of them, and at that moment, I knew my marriage was over. No, I'm not going to go along with this arrangement. Roger, Nancy said with a look that told me she was now upset with me. This is going to happen. The question is whether you are going to be part of it or not. Get lost and take this man out of my house, I said. Nancy burst into tears. Roger, please let me have this. I've been a faithful wife all these years. Brian was my first love. But I don't want to lose you. I love you so much, but I love Brian as well. I snorted and looked at Brian. Tell me, Brian, if your deceased wife came to you with a proposal like this, would you have allowed it? If it would have made my wife happy, I would have gladly agreed to it, he smiled. And what about you, Nancy? If I came home with a former girlfriend and told you I wanted you to share me with her, how would you feel about that? Nancy hesitated for a few seconds before answering. I guess I would be upset like you are right now, but I would eventually agree to it because I truly love you and want you to be happy. Well, I still have my balls in my brain. I will be contacting a lawyer in the morning to arrange for a divorce. I think the split of the assets should be pretty straightforward. The house only has a small mortgage. Once that's paid off, we'll split the proceeds. Our investments, savings, and checking accounts will be split. Jill's college fund will remain intact. There will be no alimony since you'll be living with that fool sitting there. Now, both of you, please leave. Nancy was crying hard now as Brian took her arm. When she got to the door, Nancy turned back to me and said, "The door is always open, Roger. If you change your mind, I do love you deeply. I do want you in my life." I walked up to the door and slammed it hard. Then I went to the den and started making a list of the things I needed to do. I knew exactly which attorney I'd retain. His name was Dustin Brown. He had a reputation for being a real shark in divorce proceedings. Usually, he represented the wives, and the poor husbands never knew what hit them. Over the years, we have crossed paths. I had helped him numerous times when I didn't have to. I did it because I knew the scum he was trying to stick it to. They deserve to get screwed as much as possible. The next thing on my list was our assets. I listed the house on an online portal. I had to transfer half of all our money to my accounts. I made a few calls to cancel the credit cards and apply for a new one in my name only. After reviewing my list, I realized there was one crucial task I hadn't addressed yet: calling Jill and informing her of what was happening. The mere thought of having to reveal to my little girl the truth about her mother's actions tore at my heartstrings. It took a full 5 minutes for Jill to regain her composure enough to articulate her thoughts clearly. What she expressed next caught me completely off guard. Has she gone insane, turning into a floozy, and the stupid old witch even brought her flying monkey home to parade in front of you? All those years, you have been so wonderful to us. I don't want anything to do with her. I am not going to stay in touch with her. Tell her she died for me. Jill, I said calmly, you're very upset right now, and I understand your feelings. But Nancy is your mother, and she loves you unconditionally. Don't destroy your relationship with your mother over this. We all lose if you do that. Can you at least wait a few days until you talk to your mother? If she calls me, I'm going to let her have it with both barrels. Please, if she calls, just don't answer for a few days. Promise me you'll do that. Grudgingly, she agreed to do as I asked. Later that evening, Nancy reached out to me, sounding quite worried. She had been attempting to contact Jill, but hadn't succeeded in getting through to her. I reassured Nancy, explaining that I had already spoken to Jill, and she was clearly upset. I conveyed to Nancy that our daughter needed some time to collect herself before she was ready to discuss the matter with either of us. I'll bet you poisoned her mind against me, Nancy accused me. I'll bet you painted as nasty a picture as you could. No, I did nothing like that. I just told her that her mother had to leave me because she needs a new pole to scratch. I said calmly. I knew that pissed her off. Before Nancy could say anything, I decided to take care of one of the items on my list. Oh, as long as I have you on the line, you should get yourself an attorney. Please, Roger, don't do this. She was crying again. It is killing me that you want me out of your life. I still love you so much. Can't you bend a little for me? Did you? I said and hung up. I decided to take the next week off to ensure I could focus entirely on getting everything sorted out. However, the nights proved to be unbearable. The loneliness of lying in bed by myself was overwhelming. Each morning, I would instinctively reach out for Nancy, only to be reminded of her absence. My first order of business was to call Dustin, but I was taken aback when he informed me that Brian had already reached out to him. That scoundrel was being cunning. It seemed he had already done his research to find the top divorce lawyer and had beaten me to it. Well, if I can't hire you, I expressed, feeling somewhat annoyed. Can you at least recommend someone I should hire? I mentioned that Brian contacted me. Dustin responded with a snort, but I didn't say he hired me. In fact, I informed him that you had already retained my services. Wow. I replied with a sense of immense relief. I really appreciate you doing that. Roger, it's no secret that most of the men in this town see me as the villain, he said with bitterness. But you've always shown me respect. You've gone out of your way to lend a hand when you didn't have to, and I've always appreciated that about you. I want you to know there's no chance I take a side against you. Again, it's much appreciated. You're still going to have to pay my fee, he said with a laugh. I do appreciate you, but I have to pay bills too. Not a problem, Dustin. And again, thank you. Even after a few days to calm down, the telephone conversation between Nancy and Jill did not go well. According to Jill, it devolved into a screaming match with ugly names hurled back and forth. Nancy called me afterward, almost hysterical, that she had lost her daughter forever. It's just parting. There is more to lose, I told her. I would talk to Jill and try to get things settled down. I told her and hung up. Well, that turned out to be a much harder job than I could have imagined. Jill was still spitting venom when I talked to her about a week later. According to my daughter, she had told her mother that she didn't want anything to do with her. Nancy wouldn't be invited to her graduation, to any marriage, and if there were grandchildren, she'd never meet them. Now, I understood why Nancy was in hysterics. You are my true daughter. No DNA test required, I said. She laughed at it. The calls from Nancy persisted right up until the day the divorce was finalized. She continued to plead with me to reconsider and accept their arrangement, but I refused. Once the divorce was official, the calls ceased, and I focused on moving forward. Thankfully, my work provided a welcome distraction. As chief of detectives, I had a flexible schedule, allowing me to throw myself into my duties. Over the following 6 months, I became much more hands-on, actively guiding some of our newer detectives and steering them away from dead-end leads. Additionally, I delved into our cold case files. My efforts paid off when we successfully closed a long-forgotten murder case. It turned out the ex-boyfriend was the culprit all along, and the evidence had been there but overlooked. For this achievement, I received a commendation and a well-deserved pay raise. After my divorce, Nancy swiftly remarried Brian, prompting their desire to purchase my share of the house. The mere thought of Brian living in my former home repulsed me. When Brian threatened legal action to force the sale, I stood my ground, unfazed. With the support of local appraisers, I managed to inflate the property's value significantly. Despite the inflated prices, Brian proceeded with the purchase. Though initially irked by his audacity, I eventually saw the silver lining. The sale yielded far more profit than I had ever imagined. The divorce proceedings turned out better than I had anticipated, and I owe much of that to Dustin. His meticulous questioning unearthed crucial information that worked in my favor. It was revealed that the down payment for our house originated from an inheritance from my grandfather, making it exempt from being considered community property. Consequently, I received approximately 75% of the proceeds from the sale. With that sum, I made the decision to purchase a condo outright, located conveniently close to my workplace. One night, approximately 8 months after Brian and Nancy tied the knot, I found myself dining alone in a restaurant. To my surprise, I spotted Nancy as she approached my table and took a seat. Though taken aback by her presence, I resolved not to engage in hostility. Glancing around, I noticed Brian seated at a table across the room, perusing a menu. "How are you doing, Roger?" Nancy said softly. "I'm managing," I replied with a fake smile. "And you?" "I still miss you every single day," she confessed, placing her hand atop mine. "I still love you deeply. If you could ever find it in your heart to accept Brian, I'd do anything to be with you again." Initially, I entertained the notion of pulling my hand away and dismissing her plea, but then an idea dawned on me. It was a plan I'd need to discuss with Jill first, but it presented an opportunity to get back at Brian. That jerk. "I miss you too, Nancy," I admitted sincerely. "Waking up without you has been tough, but you're a married woman now. Speaking of which, I think your husband is looking for you." Nancy glanced over at Brian, who wore a puzzled expression. She nodded at him and rose from her seat. "Just remember, I still love you," she said before walking off to join her husband. God, I never knew this woman has no brain. I called Jill that evening and laid out my plan. Initially, she was horrified, expressing her disbelief. However, as I explained the reasoning behind my idea, her tone shifted, and soon giggles erupted from her end of the line. "That's just perfect, Dad," Jill exclaimed between fits of laughter. "You absolutely should go for it." The following day, armed with my daughter's blessing, I placed the call to Nancy. I expressed my desire to have a discussion with her and Brian, and she eagerly agreed, arranging for us to meet at our former home that evening at 7. Punctually, I arrived at 7 and was ushered into the living room by Nancy. It was irksome to see Brian lounging on the couch in what used to be my domain, but I found some solace in the scowl etched on his face. It was apparent that Nancy had sprung this meeting on him at the last minute, judging by the daggers he was glaring at me. Nevertheless, I maintained my composure and acted as if I hadn't noticed. After Nancy served us coffee and settled herself between Brian and me on the couch, I wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "Nancy, when you said the offer to share was still open, did you mean it?" A smile illuminated Nancy's face. "Absolutely, Roger. I meant every word. I still deeply love you, and that offer stands. I just happen to love Brian too." "Well, if you're open to it," I said, feigning nervousness, "I would consider accepting that arrangement. Right now, I feel like I have none of you. At least this way, I'd have part of you some of the time. It's been incredibly lonely without you." Nancy's reaction was immediate and intense. She threw herself into my arms, kissing me on my lips so hard that it stirred up old emotions. "Roger, you've just made me the happiest woman alive," she exclaimed breathlessly. "I now can have both the men I love." Brian, however, rose from his seat, clearly flustered. "Hold on a minute," he interjected. "We haven't discussed this." "It's essentially the same deal," I responded calmly, directing my words to Brian. "Yeah, but still, Nancy and I need to have a proper discussion about this," Brian insisted, growing increasingly agitated. "We've already discussed it," Nancy chimed in, somewhat surprised by Brian's objection. "Remember, we talked about it before presenting the plan to Roger. You agreed that you were more than willing to share your wife, if that made her happy." Brian found himself trapped by his own words, his face reddening with frustration. Despite the setback, he persisted, saying, "I still think we need to have a more thorough discussion about this." As tempting as it was to point out Brian's hypocrisy, I chose to refrain and let Nancy and Brian have their own discussion without my presence. "Well, I'll leave you two to sort things out. I said before making my exit. "I'll await your decision, Nancy." I then proceeded to kiss her again on the lips, and this time made it French. Through the corner of my eye, I could see Brian fuming. Sitting alone in my car, I couldn't contain my laughter. I had successfully flipped the script on that jerk. Now it was Brian who was left squirming uncomfortably. Oh, how I wished I could hear their discussion that night. The tables had indeed turned, and it was a satisfying feeling. The next day, I received a call from Nancy, who informed me that Brian had been quite upset initially. However, when she called him out for being hypocritical and said she would leave if he did not agree, he relented. They agreed to a schedule where Nancy would spend 1 week with me and 1 week with Brian. Of course, Brian insisted that none of this could proceed until I underwent STD testing. I could not believe that this could actually work. Are they that dumb? I consented to the test on the condition that both Nancy and Brian also get tested. While Nancy had no objections, Brian was clearly displeased. As it turned out, the results came back clean for all of us. Next week, I went to meet them. Brian was there when I drove into his driveway. I went in and kissed Nancy. I asked her to get me some water. As she went to get water, "Hey Brian, I am going to screw your wife," and in my best Ric Flair tone said, "all night long." He was fuming, and he really wanted to hit me. I was counting on that. Put your hands on a cop and I'll put you in your place. Nancy got me a bottle, and now Brian looked pissed. Whatever anger was boiling inside him, he kept it bottled up. He made a point of kissing Nancy passionately in front of me. I just gave Nancy a peck on the cheek. I turned to Brian and said, "Thanks for bending over, Brian," and left. I guess he got what I meant. The very next day, I was out checking on 3 of my detective teams working different crime scenes. I was on my way to the second scene when a call came over the radio about a disturbance at Kitty Cat Bar. Since I was only a block away, I decided to check it out. When I got there, I discovered there had been a disturbance with a drunk patron. I was surprised to find out that the person drunk was Brian. I decided to handle this problem myself. After dismissing the 2 officers, telling them I'd handle the call, I turned to Brian. "Come on, Brian," I said, taking his arm. "I'm going to take you home." "I don't need your help," he yelled. "Brian, your choice is either I take you home or to jail. What do you want?" He decided to accept the ride home. Neither of us said a word all the way to my old house. When he got out of my car, all he said was, "F you." As I dropped him home, I walked to him and said, "Don't waste time. You have 6 days left before I come and take your wife." By the 4th day, Brian was getting less and less thrilled with the arrangement. He and Nancy were arguing more and more about it. He wanted the whole thing to stop, but Nancy couldn't see why. Finally, when I went to pick up Nancy for my week, things seemed to have boiled over. Brian and Nancy were yelling at each other in the front yard. I decided to try to calm them down. "I suggest you both calm down before this escalates," I interjected calmly, maintaining a smirk. "Otherwise, someone might end up calling the authorities." "Screw you." Brian shot back with a glare, redirecting his attention to Nancy. "If you choose to go with him, then we're finished. We have a mutually agreed upon arrangement, Brian," Nancy retorted sharply, her tone taking on an edge I hadn't witnessed before in our interactions since I'd known Brian. My ex-wife had consistently spoken to him with nothing but affectionate tones. "That arrangement is garbage," Brian yelled, his frustration evident. "And I'm warning you once more. If you go with him, it's over between us." "You don't mean that." Nancy dismissed his threat with a wave of her hand. "Let's not forget, it was you who initially proposed the idea of sharing. It was hilarious, and I was enjoying every second of it." With a made-up troubled expression, I watched as Brian stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind him. Turning to Nancy for an explanation, she simply shrugged. "He's just acting like a child," Nancy offered, linking her arm with mine. "He'll cool off soon, and everything will go back to normal." I guess you should talk to him and try to cool off things. I will pick you up in the evening, I told her and left for the office. However, things didn't return to normal. It was about to get worse, and I was not prepared for it. That afternoon I got a call from one of the detectives. "Sir, we have some bad news. There has been a homicide." I was shocked and asked, "Who is it?" "It's Nancy, sir. Brian did it." As per him, it was a fit of rage. "We have arrested him and are bringing him in." I did not expect that. I was feeling guilty for Nancy's death. What am I going to tell Jill? She will hate me for my actions. They got him in, but did not allow me near him. The team was aware of my history with Brian and asked me to be away from him. I reluctantly agreed and went back to my office. I called Jill and told her what had happened. As expected, she did not blame me but did not say much. She just heard me and said, "I need some time, Dad. I'll call when I am fine." I did not say anything else. Brian was taken to jail for the proceedings, and the paperwork began. After the autopsy, I signed for Nancy's body and prepared for the funeral. Jill joined me the next day, and we both hugged each other and cried. "I am sorry, Jill. It's all because of me. You did not pull the trigger, Dad," she said with a heavy heart. "It's the path she chose, and this is where we find ourselves now. It's not your fault." I was in my office when a woman knocked and walked in. "I am Area, FBI." She displayed her ID. "We need to have the weapon used on Nancy." I looked at her surprised. That was blunt and fast. She handed me some documents and said, "The suspect, Brian, who killed Nancy, we are investigating him for the murder of his previous wife, Amanda." "But he was not a suspect," I said. She looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "You know, some cops were paid off to look the other way. Apparently, her father had more money and more connections. He got us involved." "But he was in Japan," I questioned. "Japan and the USA have a time difference. The cops played on it in their report. He landed in Japan and boarded a flight 30 minutes later and reached the USA. So, he was in Japan and the USA on the same day." "Yes, and you never heard it from me," she said. I nodded and asked, "Why do you need the weapon?" "We suspect that it is the same that was used on his previous wife." We filed the formalities and handed her the weapon. "We will share the report with you, and you can use the same in court for this case." She stood up and left. 3 months later, Brian was found guilty of both cases and is now serving 30 years in the big house. Jill stayed with me for the next week while we mourned for her mother. It has now been over 6 months. I come back to an empty house and find myself sitting in silence. Memories of happier times flood my mind, but they only serve to deepen the ache in my heart. I only wish if Nancy was not that dumb. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.